So we're going to start with a few things about endocrine system that you need to know. Second system that plays crucial role in regulating the bodily functions, right? What I want you to appreciate, unlike responses inflicted by nervous system, you cannot really control your endocrine responses. Okay, so generally speaking, whatever hormones do is entirely out of your control. Okay. Now, there are some major differences between the responses guided by endocrine system and responses guided by the nervous system. So, in endocrine system, the responses are systemic, always. So, neural responses are local, right? So, you can have, if I touch a hot stove, I'm going to pull my hand away, and that's going to be it. That's going to be just hand. Okay. In endocrine system, if you are hungry, the whole of you is hungry. Okay. You see what I'm trying to say? Systemic responses. Obviously, involuntary. Now, one of the most fundamental features is that nervous responses are usually pretty fast, okay? If I throw an object at you, you're going to catch it right away. Endocrine responses are usually slow, much slower than nervous. We're talking about minutes to hours to sometimes even days, okay? And kind of comes from the systemic nature of responses. Nervous system responses act on very, very specific cells. You think about transmission of the motor signal to a specific set of muscle cells. That's the particular motor unit. In endocrine system, the same hormone can act on multiple cells in multiple organs. Are we clear? Does that make sense? So the main actor in endocrine system is a hormone. So what is a hormone? It's a molecule that is released in the blood, or in some cases extracellular fluid. So this is the major difference between the endocrine secretion and exocrine secretion. Endocrine secretion always is internal. And internal means what's called internal environment. So extracellular fluid or blood. Things like sweat is not endocrine, right? Gastric juice doesn't go in the blood, so it's not endocrine. So far we clear? We good? Now, another fundamental concept in endocrine system. Hormone has to interact with a receptor, always. Okay? Interacts with a receptor. What's the result of that interaction? Some kind of a signal. Does it make sense? And generally speaking, hormonal responses are regulated by negative feedback. I'm sorry. So this is my favorite bodily systems to teach. Endocrine system. Why? It's extremely logical. There's one major underlying principle right here. Check this out. You have a change or stimulus of sorts. Okay? Whatever it is. Does that make sense? Stimulus, change, which results in the release of a hormone. And the hormone leads to some kind of a response. And what this response does to the change, it abrogates this change. It removes the change. Okay, now this sounds very, very fundamental, but think of it this way. It's something sweet, your blood sugar goes up. You see that? Your blood sugar goes up, your insulin goes up. Insulin stimulates the uptake of sugar from the blood into the cells. So your blood sugar goes down. Am I clear? Your basal metabolic rate goes down. You start producing thyroid hormone, which increases your basal metabolic rate. Am I clear? For almost all the hormones, with one exception. Well, okay, two exceptions. It's always negative feedback. Okay? We can put it as negative feedback. The only two situations that I can think of where this doesn't work are delivery. We're going to talk about it. It's pretty oxytocin stimulated delivery, and the moment of ovulation during the ovarian cycle in females. That's very last topic, very last unit we're going to talk about. So far, any questions? Okay, awesome. So let's talk about anatomy really quick. I have the models there. I don't really care about the models that much. It's really easy. Endocrine system is not a continuous system like cardiovascular, respiratory, or digestive. It's a bunch of small organs all over the body. And usually it's easier to go over those organs starting at the head. So the first organ, I cannot show you where, but it's basically in the center of your head. It's hypothalamus. It's the chief. Hypothalamus, I'm going to grab this thing. So hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. So this is hypothalamus, this is pituitary gland. It's connected by infundibulum, okay? So far so good? Then you go down, and the first thing that you encounter in the neck is the thyroid gland, okay? Then you go lower, something that's not on the scheme, I gather. No, it's not. Right about here, we don't have it, like it's not functional in us, in adults. In kids it's very functional. It's thymus right here. Then you go lower and you get an abdominal cavity. So there are a few organs here. You get pancreas, just posterior to the stomach, and you get adrenal glands, which are sitting on top of your kidneys. Does that make sense? And then you go low in the pelvic cavity, and if we're talking about females, there are ovaries. If we're talking about males, testes, right? One gland that I never mentioned, these little tiny glands here, those are parathyroid glands. So the glands that we just listed, literally all of them, from hypothalamus to pancreas to ovaries, those are called primary endocrine organs, which means their main role, and in 90% cases, the only role, is to produce hormones. Does that make sense? They don't do anything else. Now, there are secondary endocrine organs. For instance, heart. Heart makes hormones. Does that make sense? Is it heart's primary job? No, it's not. But it also, organs that also make hormones are called secondary endocrine organs. So you need to know primary versus secondary endocrine organs. Any questions on this one? Now, hormones can be divided into two large groups based on their ability to be dissolved in water. Those two large groups are obviously water-soluble hormones and lipid-soluble hormones. So water-soluble hormones, there are three major categories: amines, peptides, and proteins. Again, I'm stressing this out that all those hormones are hydrophilic, can easily be dissolved in water. Lipid-soluble hormones, so thyroid hormones, steroid hormones. Okay, now in the notes, there is a third category in the lipid solubles, just under the list, leukotrienes and eicosanoids. Don't. We're not doing this. Those metabolites of arachidonic acid, we can do a separate course on those. Okay, we're just kind of not talking about it. Okay, we're good now. Generally speaking, any classification is artificial. Why separation of hormones in these two groups is so important? Well, it turns out that based on the ability to interact with water, the mechanism of action is going to be different. Okay, so we're going to start with a conversation about how lipid-soluble hormones work in general, right? So imagine that this is a target cell, okay, surrounded by a cell membrane, of course. Okay, and this is the hormone. Remember, we're talking about lipid solubles. So I'm going to ask you a basic biology question. Lipid soluble molecules, can they cross the cell membrane directly? Can they? Yes, they can. Remember, membrane inside is hydrophobic. It's lipid inside. So lipid-soluble hormones can basically cross the membrane directly and get into the cell. Does it make sense to you? So they get into the cell, and once they are inside the cell, they will interact with the receptor. So here's the first feature of lipid-soluble hormones. Their receptors, generally speaking, are inside of the cell. Are we clear? What happens next? The hormone receptor complex, which is formed inside of the cell, one way or another, reaches the nucleus. Okay? Now I need to clear my conscience here. Listen, I need to clear my conscience and tell you this. This interaction between the hormone and the receptor, it can happen in the cytoplasm. It can happen in the nucleus. Am I clear? I don't care. I'm not asking you. You're not going to get a question for that particular hormone, I don't know, for aldosterone, which is lipid-soluble hormone. So, does aldosterone interact with the receptor in a cytoplasm or in the nucleus? I don't care. You said, I want you to conceptualize this. Hormone, lipid-soluble hormone, interacts with the receptor in the cell. Not on the surface, in the cell. Am I clear? Good. One way or another, this complex ends up in the nucleus. And in the nucleus, the complex between the hormone and receptor binds to the DNA. And once it binds, it sends the signal to transcriptional enzymes to transcribe a particular part of DNA into RNA, and then RNA will be translated into the proteins. Okay? So in other words, hormone receptor complex will migrate to the nucleus, and in the nucleus it will initiate transcription. Does that make sense to you all? Transcription being, RNA synthesis. Okay, we good? Questions so far? Okay, awesome. Any questions on lipid soluble, guys? Okay. Let's move on to water soluble hormones now. So first, quick question. Water soluble hormones. Can they cross the membrane? No. Membrane is hydrophobic form. They are hydrophilic. They cannot get into the cell. If they can't get into the cell, where's the receptor?
On the outside.
On the cell surface. So here, I'm going to use one cell for 3 different mechanisms. Okay? So here you've got a receptor on the cell surface. Again, here you've got a hormone. So, first mechanism that I want you to know is that when hormone binds to the receptor, in the cytoplasmic tail of that receptor molecule sits another protein that is called a G protein. Okay? So once hormone binds to the receptor, G protein gets activated. It migrates to an enzyme, usually membrane enzyme, called adenylate cyclase. Clear? Okay. Now, the enzyme called adenylate cyclase takes a molecule of ATP and converts it into a molecule called cyclic AMP, cAMP. Okay? And this cAMP molecule initiates some kind of intracellular signaling. Doesn't really matter which one. So far, we clear? Good. Now, you may remember this mechanism of signaling because it's you learned it in AP1. It's a mechanism of signaling for olfaction, for smell. Okay? Same idea. Does that make sense? So one more time. Hormone binds to the receptor. This binding activates G protein. G protein binds to adenylate cyclase, activates adenylate cyclase. And the activated form of this enzyme makes cyclic AMP out of ATP. We good? cAMP serves as the second messenger molecule, basically signaling molecule. Got it? So that's mechanism number 1. There are going to be 3 of them. Mechanism number 2. Again, receptor and a hormone, and they bind to each other, and what you have, again, you have a G protein getting activated. So this time, this G protein binds to a different enzyme called PLC, or phospholipase C. Okay? So far we good? That makes sense? Phospholipase C, it's an enzyme. It produces an intracellular messaging molecule called IP3. It has a proper name, it's phosphatidyl inositol 3, but I don't want you to waste your effort on memorizing this. IP3 is fine. The function of IP3 is to open calcium channels, okay, on the endoplasmic reticulum. So that's ER, endoplasmic reticulum. This is your IB3 seating here, okay? And the calcium channel is open. That makes sense? So what happens next? Calcium diffuses from the endoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm. So going over this one more time, hormone binds to the receptor, and this binding activates G protein. Activated G protein activates phospholipase C. Phospholipase C churns out second messenger molecule IP3, and IP3 opens calcium channels on the endoplasmic reticulum, so calcium can diffuse into the cell. You may ask, and then some stuff starts going on inside the cell. Like calcium serves as the ultimate signal to activate various intracellular signaling cascades. Okay? That was pathway number 2. Pathway number 3, I'm going to put it here. So we've got a receptor and a hormone binding to it. This time at the cytoplasmic tail of the receptor is the huge enzyme called tyrosine kinase. Now, you probably have encountered the term kinase before. Enzymes called kinases slap a phosphate group on a protein molecule. So what tyrosine kinase does, takes a molecule of a protein, whatever target protein is, an ATP. Okay, and then it adds phosphate residue, which P here, okay? It phosphorylates the protein, leaving ADP behind. Question?
Oh, you just kind of lost me somewhere at the end.
I'm gonna go over it one more time.
Right.
So here's the thing. Hormone binds to the receptor. We see the commonality in all cases. Receptor is on the surface. Then this binding activates tyrosine kinase. And tyrosine kinase, that's the enzyme. What it does, it takes a protein, check it out, takes a protein, okay, and it adds phosphate to the protein, right? Now, phosphate is a charged polar group. Addition of a charged polar group to a protein changes the protein structure. And it can activate a protein, it can deactivate a protein, all depends on the context. Does that make sense? Did I find you?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Questions? Okay. No? Good, awesome, clear. So, to kind of wrap up, you need to know the mechanism of action for lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones. I'm going to ask you plenty of questions about those. The easiest way to learn this stuff is to draw this stuff. So, like, if you're wondering how am I supposed to study this, take a clean piece of paper and just explain it to someone. Okay, especially if you have a physically inferior person next to you, you can chain them to a table or, so they cannot run away, and then you can explain away. Okay, understand? And another thing that I strongly encourage during the exams, and Emma knows that, I bring paper in the class during the exam. If you can't bring any cheat sheets, but what you can do, when I give you an exam and I give you a Scantron, you can grab a clean piece of paper and you can start drawing whatever you want. Does that make sense? So like if you prefer to have it in front of you and just answer questions while looking at the scheme, take it away. And I gather, especially in these cases, it should really, really help. Good? Okay.